Okay, shall we begin? So everything okay on your side, huh?
Yes.
Okay, all right, we start now. Okay, a very good afternoon to our speaker, Dr. Louise Firth, and all participants. Welcome to our COASTAR webinar titled Challenges and Opportunities of Eco-Engineering in the Marine Environment. So before we begin, we have some housekeeping rules. First is to please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. You can choose to have your camera on or off. During the presentation, please write in the chat box and let us know if you can't see or hear anything. You're welcome to use the chat box throughout. The event will be recorded and made available to the participants via a shared link later this week. So now a little bit of introduction to our project COASTAR, which is short for Coastal Ocean Actionable and Sustainable Teaching and Research. Okay, this project was funded by the British Council and MITE, and a collaboration between University Malaya, Edinburgh, Napier University, and also University of Science Malaysia. So this is a fellowship that fosters new network among early career researchers, academic mentors, and relevant stakeholders engaged in coastal issues. Under the mentorships of several outstanding multidisciplinary researchers from Edinburgh, Napier University, University Malaya, and University of Science Malaysia, fellows engage in a year-long series of empowerment and capacity building training modules. And the program will ultimately pioneer the development of a functioning coastal sustainable project that will deliver climate and development benefits. So for today, we focus on the topics of a relatively young field, eco-engineering in the marine environment, and highlights where future efforts should be targeted. We have with us today Dr. Louise Firth, who is a lecturer in marine ecology at the University of Plymouth. She's a marine ecologist who works in both natural and artificial coastal environments. Her research interests are mainly in the relationship between humans and coastal ecosystems, and she is particularly interested in ecological engineering. So without further ado, I'll invite Dr. Louise to give her talk.
Thank you, Suyin. I'm just going to stop sharing this talk and share the other one. Okay, you should be able to see that now, Soon Long. Can you just confirm, please?
Yes, all good, Louise.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to give this talk to you all. A really warm welcome to everyone in the room physically with me, and also to everyone else online. I'm enjoying my time in Malaysia. So yes, I'm going to give a talk about one of my favourite research interests, ecological engineering in the marine environment, and specifically I'm going to talk about the challenges and opportunities that this relatively new field presents for us all. So as human beings, we of course rely on biodiversity. We need biodiversity for all of the various ecosystem services, as we refer to them, that we rely on from our natural environments. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the various different services that we need, but we need marine environments for flood protection, we need them for food, we need them for cultural and religious services, as well as many other services that we value as human beings. One of the major threats to coastal biodiversity is the artificialization, I know it's not a word, of the global ocean. This is the construction of all sorts of marine artificial structures in our coastal and high seas. This map here is showing you a global map of where the footprint of marine construction is in coastal areas. And the darker the blue is showing you the higher number of artificial structures in that particular area. And you can see here around Southeast Asia there's quite a lot of dark blue where we're currently sitting today. Of course, where we are today in Penang is no stranger to artificialization. This is a map that we produced back in 2017. This is a paper that Su Yin beside me led. And this was basically a map pulling together the sort of state of affairs on the island of Penang as it was back in 2017. And this is showing you all around the coast. You can see there's a thick black line, particularly all along the east coast and along the north coast. And this is effectively hard engineered structures all along the coastline. I'd like to draw your attention to the red shapes in this map as well. These are, well, at the time they were planned land reclamation that was going to happen around the island of Penang. The three on the south coast have not started yet, but if you go on Google Earth today, you can see the islands in the north developing as we speak. The last time I was lucky enough to visit Penang was in 2019. And I can tell you that they've made huge progress on the islands and on the north coast in that time. So this is where ecological engineering comes in, or we say eco-engineering for short. As a way of balancing the impacts of humans in our coastal environments, we attempt to mitigate and compensate for our actions in the environment. And this is where eco-engineering really comes into its own. The definition of eco-engineering is the design of sustainable ecosystems that integrate human society with its natural environment for the benefit of both. So this is really a way of trying to sort of balance development and human and economic needs with the biodiversity and environmental needs that we rely on to sustain ourselves. And I just want to talk to you about a few examples of how we're actually doing this. So I'm now talking specifically about hard engineered structures, things like seawalls, rock armoring, any kind of coastal defence structure that's typically made of hard engineered material. I'm not talking about mangroves, I'm not talking about salt marshes or mudflats. We're on the sort of grey end of the sphere here. There's lots of examples out there of very successful ways of enhancing biodiversity and promoting ecosystem services on artificial structures. And people can do this in a range of different ways, ranging from small scale all the way up to large scale. So just focusing on the small scale, examples of how we can enhance the biodiversity is through actually working with the material itself. A lot of the time we use concrete in the marine environment. And of course, we can alter the texture and the composition of concrete. We can alter its physical makeup and its chemical makeup as well, which can have benefits for biodiversity. We can incorporate pits and crevices, very easy to do if you're working at concrete, but we can also incorporate pits and crevices in other ways through drilling and various other retrofitted techniques. We can also transplant biodiversity. Just like we do on land, there's many species that might be of particular interest from a commercial or perhaps a conservation or even aesthetic. We can easily do this in the marine environment. We're just a bit behind the terrestrial environment, but certainly there's a lot of wonderful work going on as we speak, and there are many success stories emerging from how to do this. And of course, in the intertidal environment, which is typically where I typically work, artificial rock pools can be a very successful way of promoting biodiversity in the intertidal environment. So just to sort of take this to Malaysian examples, this first example here is showing you, it's basically combining three of the examples I just had on the last slide, texture, crevices and transplants. This was work led by Su Yin here in Penang, working with these concrete tiles that had complexity factored into the design of the tile, and then a local bivalve, so it was a local oyster in this case, was transplanted directly onto the tile to help create further complexity, which was deemed beneficial for biodiversity. This was part of a big global initiative called the World Harbour Project. I was also involved in this in Plymouth in the UK, as well as many other partners all over the world. Another a Malaysian example, this one linking to artificial rock pools. I think a couple of people in the audience might recognize themselves in these images here. But these are artificial rock pools that were attached to Straits Quay Marina here in Penang. And you can see here in the image that you can see two on the left and one on the right. And the idea was that these would create rock pools on a vertical seawall that would not normally be there, which of course enhanced biodiversity and attracted many fish into this environment as well, who were curious to investigate these pools. Just sticking with the artificial rock pool example, another example that was done here locally in Penang at 3 locations was actually drilling artificial rock pools directly into the rock revetment itself. And you can see here the drilling happening in the image on the left, monitoring happening in the image in the middle, and you can see at the image on the right, some of the pools did become filled in with some pebbles and sometimes sediments, depending on the time of the year. So they didn't always necessarily function as a hard rock pool. They sometimes actually functioned as other types of habitats as well. But these were found to be quite successful in enhancing the biodiversity and other ecosystem services on these rock revetments. And of course, some of the examples of this smaller scale research was award winning. And Suyin and Shia and team have been very successful in winning awards locally here for their efforts. So congratulations to them on these efforts. So if we're just scaling up, of course, there are other examples of how eco-engineering can be scaled up. These examples here are just showing you some medium scale examples. All 3 of these examples were actually using concrete to create habitat enhancement units. The one on the left is our own bioblock that we created in Plymouth, and you can see there are many habitat types on that bioblock. And the idea is the greater number of habitat types that you have, the greater numbers of species that can fill those niches. Reef balls are probably quite a famous example in the middle. And then eConcrete Tech, a company based in Israel, have designed all sorts of different habitat enhancement units. I've just got one example of an image on the right-hand side, but there are many more if you go onto their website. And then, of course, eco-engineering, ultimately, the goal is that it will actually scale up to real-life scale interventions that are happening at appropriate scales for both humans and the environment. And these are just 2 examples here showing you how this can actually scale up. And this is ultimately the direction that this field is going to go in the future. The image on the left is again work done by the Israeli company eConcrete Tech. And you can see in the image there that there are large concrete panels. And the idea is that rather than having a marina wall or a seawall just faced in plain concrete, which is too smooth for marine life to settle on, if you factor in complexity, marine life will indeed settle on the concrete panels. And these are beginning to sort of get to the scale that we need to be working in the marine environment. The images on the right-hand side are examples from Seattle on the west coast of the United States. And this is still probably one of the best examples of really large scaled up eco-engineering happening in a range of different habitats. The example I'm showing you here is it's a seawall underneath a walkway, and you can see the light penetrating panels above the walkway, allowing light to come through to the marine environment underneath. This is part of a much bigger project that involved the creation of artificial beaches, as well as interventions happening on land as well. So this is the direction that this research is going in. We're very much still probably working in experimental scales, but this is where we're going to go in the future. And of course, where possible, we can actually work with a hybrid approach. And this is really sort of combining the grey and the green. The grey here referring to the hard engineered structures, and the green here would be referring to sort of natural defences in this case. These are just images from Sydney, where you have 2 images on the left showing before, 2 images on the right showing after at 2 different locations. And you can see in the before images, we had a grassy area coming up to a very vertical seawall, which of course, if you imagine the connectivity between land and sea, that is very much a wall between the 2 different environments. On the right-hand side, you can see after they removed the vertical seawall, and you can imagine if you're thinking about organisms trying to move from land to sea, or you're thinking about nutrient transfer, it's much easier to move between the interface of land and sea on the right-hand side. This kind of approach, of course, takes space. If you're working in a very urban environment, this may not be a viable solution. But where space allows it, this is absolutely a very good approach to take. So many of the examples of this kind of work in a Malaysian context have actually been captured in a very recent paper led by Su Yin, but many colleagues nationally and internationally that have been contributing to it, including myself. And you can download this paper for yourselves if you want to see a very in-depth summary of work that's been done in Malaysia on not just hard engineered structures, but all sorts of nature-based solutions in a Malaysian context. And this is great because a lot of this work is actually making it into the mainstream media. This example here is just showing you some of the work in Seattle, actually, that featured in Hakai magazine. I don't know if anyone's actually read this magazine, but it's a really nice online glossy magazine that communicates science to the general public. And this certainly was a great way of communicating the wonderful work done in Seattle. Reuters, obviously a big international communication agency. Here's the wonderful work from Sydney Living Seawalls being communicated via an international news agency. And of course, many other examples are maybe a little bit more local scale. This image here is showing you a New Zealand example featuring in national media there. So not only is this work featuring in scientific papers that are coming out all over the world, it's a really active area of research, but it's certainly getting into the national and international media as well. This is all great. We are in a really good position, but it does come with a bit of a but. There are limitations. Like all fields that are emerging, there's a lot to learn still. It is still a very young field. To date, the vast majority of the experiments they've been quite small scale and quite short term, often done by academic researchers like myself. Really, we need this work to be happening at scale and done by engineers and landscape architects who are working at the real life scales. If you look at the literature, there's certainly to date still a bit of a temperate bias. A lot of work is going on in the tropics, and it's emerging now, which is great news. But yeah, we need to get a bit more global coverage to show how this work works under various different environmental scenarios. A lot of the papers today, and I will include many of my own papers in this, we have focused on quite simple biodiversity measures to date, but there's a lot of work to be done sort of going beyond simple numbers of species and counts, and we can do a lot more and ask more interesting questions moving forward. And arguably, I think a lot of this research to date has been designed to succeed. If taxpayers are ultimately going to be paying for this when it happens at real scale, we really need to focus on testing when it doesn't work rather than when it does work. So I would advocate that people actually try to test for failure to find out when it's going to be a waste of money doing this kind of work. There's also, this is something that we're very concerned about, is that this kind of research could potentially be abused and used for harm through greenwashing. Of course, development companies looking to get approval on their developments, they can see this kind of research as a way of ticking the green box, which may help them to get fast-tracked approvals, or certainly it might make a development look more appealing to the regulators, often made on a promise that might be based on quite a short-term or small-scale experiment. So this is something that we're very concerned about. But what can be done about this? And this is something that we've spent quite a lot of time thinking about. Quite simply, the answer is lots. The researchers can actually do a lot to prevent this kind of thing happening. One is bigger experiments. And we're already beginning to do this. Certainly, when I started working in this field back in 2009, there were a handful of studies that you could put under an engineer's nose and say, hey, look, this is a good idea. And it would have been done in one place once, and there was no replication of that study. We are now in a place where people are starting to deploy experiments at a global scale. And this is an example from the World Harbour Project, where an identical experiment was repeated all over the world. And it was quite a simple experiment, just looking at 3 levels of complexity. You can see from the images, you've got a flat tile, medium complexity in the middle, and high complexity on the right. And we would have expected that there would be almost like a linear relationship between the numbers of species and the complexity of the tiles. And you can see on the right-hand side, the panels from the results from this experiment. And you can see here that the vast majority of the locations did indeed show this trend. And when you had more complex tiles, you tended to get greater numbers of species. But a number of locations, there was no significant difference. So it does seem that you can get quite variable results. And even a simple experiment like this, there's no one size fits all. Okay, we may not always expect to see the exact same results in different places. We can build the evidence base. I just said a couple of slides ago that when I started working in this field, there was very little evidence out there. This is a really active area of research. It's a bit intimidating to work in it because you can't stay on top of the literature very easily. It's very active. But we're beginning to build the evidence base, and I was very fortunate to be involved in this conservation evidence synopsis, which was published last year, which was led by Ali Evans from the University of Aberystwyth. And this pulled together all of the global work that had been done up until a point in 2020, and it pulled together all of the evidence base, showcasing what's been done, how many times it's been repeated, and what the sort of general outcome of that research was. This is freely available to everybody, and it's a wonderful resource for managers, and I would strongly urge people to go and check this out if they're thinking about working with a hard engineered structure in the marine environment. As I said, we can go beyond, much of the research to date is focused on simple biodiversity measures, but we're now thankfully going beyond that. This is an example from work done by Mariana Meyer-Pinto in Sydney, and this was looking at biofiltration of oysters. So this is not just counting the numbers of species, it's actually looking at another function of organisms on engineered environments. And we need to be doing a lot more of this kind of thing to push the boat out and tell us a little bit more, not just about how biodiversity is responding, but how the functioning of these environments is also responding to these interventions. Another thing we can do that will build the evidence base is repeating and revisiting existing experiments. This paper that I show here is a paper that we published back in 2014. We've actually gone back and revisited a lot of our experiments from when it was published in 2014. Nearly 10 years later, it's quite interesting to look at how experiments perform in the long term. In Plymouth, we're also about to install another example of the living seawall, which was started in Sydney. So in spring next year, we're going to be deploying a full-scale living seawall in Plymouth. And this is very important to be building the evidence base of the exact same experiment in a different environmental context to see how it performs. And this, of course, will build the evidence base on whether this could be a one-size-fits-all type of solution. And actually, we have quite a network of people who are going back and revisiting their experiments all over the world. And the idea is we'll eventually pull together a synopsis of how those experiments have fared in the longer term and also in different parts of the world under different environmental scenarios. Importantly, this is something I really believe in. Rather than just telling the story of the results if they were significant, it's really actually important to report on any kind of failure, as you might anticipate it, or unintended outcomes. And this is where journals must play a part in this important message. There is a little bit of a bias in the literature towards significant results. When it comes to applied research like this, it's really important to publish non-significant results and surprise results, and arguably the failures as well. This will be the building blocks that we will use to help learn and develop bigger and better solutions going into the future. So I would argue that people should never be afraid to try and publish something just because it didn't have a significant result. And think big. Just think about the slide of Penang looking at the artificial islands. We're going to have to think big about the kind of solutions moving into the future. This is a very interdisciplinary field. It started off with engineers and biologists working together. It's now completely grown. Artists are involved, landscape designers, musicians are getting involved in this kind of work. It really does need to be interdisciplinary, and the more minds and ideas that we can bring together, the better they will be. And we also just need to be thinking bigger in terms of scale as well. So just some things to be thinking about. It's all good. It's all going in the right direction. The media is out there. The world is listening, and they're paying attention, and they're looking to us for solutions when it comes to hard structures in the marine environment. But there are some major challenges out there. This image here is a Google Earth image of Dubai. Of course, Dubai is very famous for the very large-scale artificial islands and major coastal developments along the coast. Any kind of new development at this kind of scale, eco-engineering, yes, it can play a part. But if you're building a new development over something like a coral reef, for instance, no amount of eco-engineering is really going to make up for the damage it's going to cause to that environment. So when and where eco-engineering is deployed can have a major influence on the benefits to nature. Any kind of new developments such as these kind of examples, it's always going to be hard to benefit nature. If it's a redevelopment or going back and rejuvenating an area that's been left derelict, for instance, anything that you do is going in the right direction, and the benefits for nature are much more obvious and easy. So this is something to be taken into consideration, considering mega developments which are very much on the increase. And of course, depending on where we are in the world, there will of course be different policies. This image here is just showing you a global distribution of biodiversity offset policies. And you can see here, there's lots of different colors here showing you the various different sort of advancements that people have made in relation to whether they have full-scale biodiversity offset policies or not, depending on where you are. So depending on where we are in the world, there might be very different policies linked to the environment and biodiversity. And this can, of course, have a huge influence on attitudes to eco-engineering or any kind of conservation measures. And just a final thought, just in the short time that I've been speaking, there's probably been about 5,000 people added to the Earth. Coastal development is a thing that's going to stick with us for the foreseeable future. At some point, we may, hopefully not, reach 11 billion people or more. So we can't just turn away from this and say it's a difficult thing to do. There was a time a few years ago where I thought, oh God, this is awful. I don't want to be involved in this research anymore. But that's not good enough. We can't bury our heads in the sand. This is a thing of the future. Coastal development is going to continue, whether we like it or not. And we need to have a place at the table, talking to the engineers, talking to the developers, having difficult conversations, hearing things that we don't want to hear about, but having your voice heard and having a say. So I'm back at the table again. I'm not afraid anymore. So I'd like to finish there. I'd like to say Terima kasih to everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you all. Thank you to Amy, Suyin, Sun Long, all at COASTAR, everyone here in the audience here, everyone listening online. I've loads of collaborators and people to thank, but yeah, no, just a short thank you to everyone, and yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Louise, for this very informative talk. We will look now at questions. Yep. Okay. Whether we have questions from
I'm just trying to stop sharing screen.
Hi, everyone. I just turn on the allow everyone to able to turn on your camera and also mic if you have questions that you want to ask to our speaker. Thank you. Or alternatively, you can also type your question in the chat box. All right.
Anybody in the audience have any question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Theo from SEBA. Actually, I have one question. Thank you for your interesting talk. It's very interesting for the ecology and design. The thing that I want to ask is, how do you measure the restoration of the diversity? You know, when you have implement this system. So do you have any measurement to see how the fish species or the algae species or something that is being restored in that particular area when you start to build this system? I mean, from start to the end. So how many fish coming back or some? Yeah. I'm not marine biologist, but I would like to know a bit more about how do you measure the restoration of the diversity in that area that you design. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, depending on the organisms that you're interested in, you'll have a different way of surveying them. So, for instance, if you're trying to understand the biodiversity of organisms living directly on the seawall, we would use sampling units called quadrats. So these are just basically square units, and you'd place them on the seawall and count the organisms that are within it. You would use something different for fish, for instance. So you can use like a lot of people use cameras, for instance. They would put them underwater and they would either take photographs or they film, and then they would go back over the film, watch it, identify them, and count them. If you're looking at something like mangroves, for instance, you might use a much larger, not quadrat, but like area, and you would identify and measure everything within that area. So depending on the species that you're interested in, you would use different sampling techniques. But the best kind of information would come from being able to identify the species to the lowest level possible. So rather than just calling it, a fish or a bird, they will have very different functions. So the greater resolution of identification, the more information that you can get, because you will have very different species doing different things. Does that answer the question?
Yes. Thank you for your questions. One thing I would like to ask: do you think that if you apply something like next generation sequencing techniques in terms of toward like environmental DNA, would that be able to help to determine the diversity of the living organism? The fish, prawn, or all the different species there.
Yeah.
Rather than when you use a camera and others like that, may be more qualitative. So if you can use other technique to be more quantitative to measure how many % of the population has been restored or has been lost due to these destructions or design, things like that. So just a question.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of people are using eDNA
yes,
as a tool now. In particular, in relation to artificial structures, so things like seawalls, marinas, that kind of thing. One of the things that we find is often they will support a lot of invasive species, and people use eDNA as a way of sort of finding the invasive species before they actually arrive, if you know what I mean. So we mightn't see them with their eye, but the larvae might be in the water, for instance. So yeah, people will be using eDNA as a way of sort of quicker monitoring and looking, to try and find it quicker than somebody would see it with the eye. Yes, that's another popular technique for monitoring. Yes.
So, in your project, did you implement this technology, the eDNA in your project to monitor the restoration? No.
No, I don't use it myself, but other people are.
All right. Okay. All right. Thank you.
There's a question here from Amanda. So given your experiences with this field, I would like to ask, does any of those attempts actually make a species more dominant than the others? That's a really good question, and it's actually it's going to be the subject of a project that we have going on in Plymouth. Yeah, I think it does. To give you an example, so when we create seawalls, so seawalls are often either made of concrete or they're made of engineered rock that's very smooth. We feel in Plymouth and in the UK more generally that when you create a very smooth environment like that, it actually allows for things like limpets to become very abundant. And because they're so smooth, limpets are actually, they're really good at grazing on a very smooth environment. And we feel that actually it basically precludes other species from living on the seawalls. So through factoring in complexity, so places like nooks and crannies, crevices, that allows allows species to escape the grazing activity of limpets. So we think that that's one. It's not necessarily the smoothness of the environment that's important. It's allowing organisms to escape grazing in this context. This won't be the case all over the place, but we think in a UK context, limpets are just amazing at grazing, which prevents other species. So it's sort of like a combined approach of the smoothness and the limpet activity. But some of the techniques may facilitate certain species. I'm trying to think of some examples. They're not in the literature, but we have found when we've gone back to some of our repeat experiments, we found that some species are actually doing quite well in some of our eco-engineered habitats that would not normally be able to be there. So yes, we do find that is happening. But yeah, that's quite a general answer to a specific question. I hope that answers your question. Harinder, yes.
Thank you for your talk. Very interesting talk. I just want to find out, do you have any measure of the size of your eco-engineering structures to the actual size of the development? Is there a ratio, or is it because of funding?
That's a really good question. I think the simple answer is no, but this is something that we do need to be thinking about. There was a project called the EcoStructure Project, which was a Wales, Ireland project. If you just Google EcoStructure, you'll be able to find it. One of the things that they were looking at in that project was scaling up some of these drilled rock pools, because the original experiment, there was only a few drilled rock pools, but then they were trying to look at it in relation to many coastal defence structures, and whether you have only a few rock pools or whether you have many rock pools on that coastal defence structure. I think we're not doing enough yet at real scale to be able to sort of reflect it in terms of the sort of proportional size in comparison to the actual development. But this is something that I think we really do need to be thinking about moving into the future, because how do you scale up is one of the biggest questions that we have with this field. We're just not really in a position to answer that yet. But this is where the developers come in. This is where we need to be doing things at the appropriate scale to be able to answer that question. Hopefully we'll be able to answer it sooner rather than later. Oh, thanks for, yeah, soon Long has just shared the EcoStructure project in the chat for people. Thank you. Another question? Yeah. Oh, sorry, yeah. Thank you for the answer and clarification. Were there any continuous study on, let's say, successful implementation of those things actually sort of introduce new population? Attracting predators, for instance. I'm not aware of any myself, but that doesn't mean to say that that's not happening. As I said, I'm struggling to stay on top of the literature at the moment. But I can't think of any off the top of my head. No, sorry, I can't. Yes, thank you. Sorry. Yes, there was some work done in Italy. So it was Filippo Ferrario's work, and I think it was published in Journal of Applied Ecology. So this was looking at the effect of transplanting macroalgae. So there's a species of macroalgae called Cystocera barbata. They were transplanting them onto artificial structures as a management technique to see how they might survive in these artificial environments, because their natural habitats were being destroyed. And they found that by transplanting the Cystocera, it was attracting more fish to those artificial structures than if the Cystocera wasn't there. So, and the fish in the Mediterranean, herbivorous fish are really important, and we're only really beginning to appreciate how important they are. But yeah, so having the algae there attracted the fish in, and of course the fish then were eating the algae. So they ended up having to put little cages around the algae to enable it to grow to a size where it wasn't susceptible to predation. So yes, that's an example of one where the technique actually did bring in more predators. But that's a good thing, I guess. It just wasn't good for the species that was being transplanted in this case. Good question, thanks. Question here from Daisuke. Hi Daisuke. Thanks for a great talk. You talk a lot about how we can use hard eco-engineering to enhance biodiversity. I just wonder what you think about opportunities and challenges to incorporate eco-engineering into coastal management to combat climate change impacts. For example, reduction of carbon footprint, reduction of coastal erosion, etc. Yeah, I think the carbon footprint is a big one that the material scientists are working quite hard on at the moment. As we're all aware, concrete is one of the most widespread materials in the marine and terrestrial environment, and there's a lot of work going on, I would say globally, looking at how to reduce the carbon footprint of concrete. And I'm aware of a number of projects. Obviously, one was in Singapore. Certainly, the EcoStructure project I was talking about. They also have done a lot of work working with the chemical makeup of concrete and using recycled materials to reduce the carbon footprint. In terms of coastal erosion, yeah, the EcoStructure project, again, they certainly found that even quite small scale interventions on seawalls actually had quite a big impact on dissipating wave energy at the scale of a seawall. So by factoring in roughness into the actual structure itself, that can actually have quite a significant effect on dissipating wave energy as it's actually hitting the structure. Another thing that these interventions can do, they can be beneficial to the lifetime of the actual structure itself. So for example, something like concrete, it's very susceptible to extremes in temperature. So through encouraging marine life to colonize the concrete, that then creates what's referred to as a bioprotective layer. So things like barnacles, they're made of calcium carbonate. They can actually effectively act as a buffer, dissipating temperature differences on concrete. Similarly, in environments where you have macroalgae that will grow on concrete, that of course is just a layer protecting the concrete against thermal extremes. So I think a lot of the time, just through encouraging the biodiversity to live in these environments, it can actually promote the longevity of the structure of the material inadvertently. Thanks for your question, Daisuke. Any other questions?
Hi, Louise.
Hi, Amy. How are you?
I'm good. Lovely talk again. No matter how many times I listen to, well, sort of like the similar talk from yourself, I always learn something new. And I'm particularly intrigued, right, about your suggestion to look for the reasons, right, for some of the failures of these efforts. And I totally think that that makes sense. So, based on your work, particularly the one you showed where, it's not necessarily always clear evidence everywhere, right, for the increase in biodiversity with complexity of the structures introduced. So I'm curious to know what are some of your thoughts, on what are some of the failure reasons, I mean, obviously, experimental design, if you will probably be one, but I'm just wondering whether, what are some of the other factors that might be important. I think you mentioned like obviously hydrodynamics, probably recruitment of existing species, within the area. And I'm thinking possibly proximity to some other healthy coastal ecosystems might also be important. But those are just some of the reasons for failure that I could think of. But I'm curious to know what are some of your thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, I have lots of thoughts on failure because I've had many myself. I think so some of the time, and it's interesting because it's such interdisciplinary work that you speak to lots of people about different things, and everyone has a different concern or goal with this kind of work. Certainly, when I speak to councillors and engineers that work at a municipal level, safety is their first concern. So anything that would encourage members of the public to climb up on the structures or might get damaged and then sort of leave debris around, that kind of thing. Of course, anytime you're attaching any kind of thing in the marine environment, you're dealing with the natural environment, waves crashing. We need to think very carefully about where we place these units, for instance. So, like for example, the panels that I showed you from Israel, those kind of panels, even though they're very large, they could only really be used in a quite a sheltered environment. So it's important that we place these things in the correct environment. Certainly, any kind of unit that you're putting into rock revetment or a groin or a breakwater type structure, if there's sediment around, there's always a chance that sediment is going to come in and not just fill up the spaces if there's nooks and crannies and crevices in the eco-engineered unit, for instance, like the bioblock, for instance. Depending on what the function of that artificial structure is, it might actually cause like a raise in the level of the beach, for instance. We found that our bioblock, following a storm in 2014, it disappeared because the level of the beach rose so much as a result of a major storm. It has never emerged from the sand since. So there's many ways that there's many ways that things can fail, and just breaking units, losing units for lots of different reasons is one of them. But I think what you said, connectivity to natural populations is a critical one, and this is where local knowledge of anywhere where there might be like a biogeographic break or a natural break that might prevent movement of propagules between areas. So classic examples would be, rivers coming out. It'll only go one direction, for instance. If you want connectivity going this direction, you need to look after, you need to understand the local environment. And yeah, connectivity is something that we're actually looking to do a lot of work on over the next few years, and we've got a PhD student starting in September, specifically addressing the connectivity question. But this requires local and in-depth knowledge of not only the populations but also hydrodynamics and other factors, environmental factors.
Thanks, Louise. That's really insightful, and I think that the case for success is really coming back again to what are the objectives in the beginning, right? So I think that's a really good point. I think that, you know, this work is really interesting, you know, and I hope that, you know, there will be further evidence base, you know, from Southeast Asia, including Malaysia, and So Yin in the background, I'm sure, you know, you are thinking of, you know, additional experiments, you know, so I certainly hope to see, you know, the advancements of use of ecological engineering within the Malaysian space as well. So thanks so much, Louise.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks for your question. I can see there was another question. Oh no, I've done that one. Yep. Harinder again, yeah. Hi. Is there a difference between small-scale experiments versus large-scale experiments with regards to species richness and community stability? For example, small artificial rock pools versus large artificial rock pools. There will be. We've tried to address that with our own research a little bit, looking at sort of shallow rock pools versus deeper rock pools. And you will find that every species has a very particular, what we call niche. So this is the set of environmental requirements that a species needs in order to persist. So for instance, some organisms like to be in the light, others prefer to be in the dark. Some species prefer particular depths, other species prefer to be on, you know, warmer rock faces than others. So the greater numbers of niches and environmental variability that we can create, you will of course get greater biodiversity, you get higher numbers of species. Most of the experiments to date have been sort of at a very small scale. I think moving into the future, we really do need to be like scaling these things up to, you know, the kind of scales that they're happening in the natural environment. I don't think we're really in a place to answer that question broadly yet. There will be some quite specific examples from the field, but yeah, I don't think we can answer that on a broad spatial scale yet. But watch this space. And I can see there's another question from Naraini. I like 6 steps to ensure the sustainable eco-development. In a rapid changing climate with many still remain unclear, is there usually a backup plan to ensure the development remains sustainable? That's a question that I don't know if I can answer that. That will depend on the development. The word sustainability can mean so many different things. It can be sustainable in a carbon sense. It can be sustainable in a biodiversity sense. I mean, ultimately, the goal would be that a development would be sustainable. But yeah, no, I think, yeah, I can't answer that question, unfortunately, in terms of backup. That's sort of beyond my expertise. Sorry. Any other questions or comments? Oh yeah, Tom.
Yeah, just a simple questions. It's about the cost. Are there any like cost implication for developers or policymakers such as the state government? Like it's a cost implication expensive?
Yeah. For the benefit of everyone online, the question from Hong was about cost, and you know, the state government, you know, how does all of this link to cost? I think, well, everything costs money, and people want everything as cheap as they possibly can. Certainly, we've had lots of conversations with developers and people making decisions about using eco-engineering, and cost always is a question. But I would argue, when we're talking about real-world developments, eco-engineering can be incorporated if the conversation happens early enough. It can be incorporated into the actual design, you know, the blueprint designs, rather than, you know, retrofitting something after. If you're retrofitting something onto an existing structure or an existing design, it is going to become more expensive, and it probably needs to be on a smaller scale. If those conversations happen much earlier, I think it can be enveloped by the overall cost and can be cheaper ultimately. Yeah. but they all care about cost.
Yes, that's the main question for the developers.
Yeah.
Then perhaps, I mean, I'm not sure, I mean, if you guys have perhaps to engage or gain traction or attention amongst the developers or the engineers, perhaps you can contact the for Malaysia, actually, the IEM, Institute of Engineers of Malaysia, and organize similar webinars for them.
Oh.
Then they might get their attention. It's going to be something.
No, that's a really good suggestion. Yeah.
Like, those like civil engineers, consultants.
Yeah.
Then they might suggest something. It's a good way to get their attention.
It's a really good suggestion. Just for the benefit of everyone online, so Hong's suggestion was about engaging with the ICM, IEM, the Institute of Engineers Malaysia, and that is a really good suggestion. We've actually engaged with them a little bit in a global context. So there's the ICM, the Institute of Civil Engineers, and they are a global body. And actually, they what a wonderful body. They get experts in to give webinars that they then make available to their staff as part of their continuous professional development. So I was very fortunate to be invited to do one of these webinars only about a month ago, which is now online. But it would be really good to engage locally here. Actually, that's a really good suggestion.
We'll be able to get the point of view.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and every country has different concerns, and what's going on in Penang, there'll be very specific concerns. So I think, not necessarily engaging globally. You really do need to engage at all levels. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Thanks. That's one for you.
Actually, I've done it already.
Oh, you done? Okay, good. Just checking the questions. Soon Long, thank you, Louise. My question is on the limitation from your past experiences in this field. Were there a lot of limitations or obstacles coming from the government sectors? If there are, what are the examples and workaround? Cost is definitely a concern. One of the things that I think is a barrier to this work is the scaling up factor. They all want to know how this stuff will scale up in the longer term and larger scale. And I think as well, depending on where you are, lack of political drivers, and that could be legislation or policy. I think that is a major gap in certain countries because it's lacking. So I would say the workaround in these contexts is, I guess, having open conversations and hoping that somebody is willing to sort of take a risk in some ways. I mean, all of this research started with just a conversation. Certainly when I initiated my first experiment, I think the people thought I was mad. But 2 years of conversation eventually ended up in an experiment, and here we are. So yeah, I think sharing ideas and talking and being open to letting people in. Yeah. I'm just aware of the time now. Thank you, Asad.
Sun Long?
Yes.
Would you like to go?
No, that's it. Thank you. Thank you for the answer.
Would you like to close, Sun Long?
Oh, okay. Sorry, close. You mean okay? Yes. Well, thank you very much to our speakers and also our team from USM for this webinar lecture. So, just before we end this session, right, just to remind everyone that the slides and also the recording of this session will be shared to everyone afterward. So, and okay, we have one question regarding an e-certificate for participants. So I'm sorry to say that we do not have this for the participant at this moment. However, we will be able to share the slides and also the recording of this. session afterward. All right. And okay, once again, thank you very much. Thank you, Emma, for your participation, and we hope to see you again for our next webinar or workshop sessions. All right. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
It's John. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Thank you from Sweden.
Do you want me to stay on?
It's fine. I'll drop you an email. Yeah.
Yeah, no, please do. Yeah, no, that'd be great. No, thank you for joining. Really nice to see you.